My name is Bob Karlicek. I'm the moderator of this panel discussion, and I'm currently a professor of electrical engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Prior to joining RPI, I spent about 30 years doing technology management at a wide variety of companies, both big and small. And so this is a really interesting topic for all of us in the hard tech space. First, I want to say a couple of words about Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. It's the oldest technological institute in the United States, founded in 1824. It's got more than 30 research centers, about 140 academic programs, and a very long history of innovation in the semiconductor hard tech space. I think that one of the things that this panel today is going to be taking a look at is the critical interface between the development of what universities have the responsibility of doing, which is innovation, education, and then technology transfer of what they've learned on campus to the industry space, and then how we actually manage that in a way which is beneficial to the universities, to the inventors, and especially to the overall technical environment in which we're trying to be competitive and advance the technological solutions to many of the problems we face in the world today. So we have three distinguished speakers today, each addressing this particular area of technology innovation and transfer from the university to the market space. Our first speaker today is Lisa Kuuttila. She's the CEO and Chief Economic Development Officer of the University of New Mexico, Rainforest Innovations. She joined UNM in 2003, and she's currently the CEO and Chief Economic Development Officer there. And really under her leadership, UNM is really substantially growing its program using what they call the Rainforest model to develop an innovation ecosystem in the state of New Mexico. She has more than 30 years of prior experience in this area, including technology commercialization responsibilities at Purdue, Georgia Tech, and Iowa State University. She is an electrical engineer, having received her degree from the University of Michigan, and she has a master's degree in public administration from Iowa State University. And she's also a graduate of the Venture Capital Institute. And so with that, let's turn it over to our first panelist today, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Bob. And it's a pleasure to be here today to talk about this important topic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about UNM Rainforest Innovations, just to set the context, talk about how we commercialize our technologies, and I'll try to keep a focus on the semiconductor industry as I do that, and then really spend a little bit of time on our startup process, which I think is one of the main areas of interest for how universities really commercialize their technologies via startup companies, and those in particular that can work with larger firms. So I'll start by talking about what does UNM Rainforest Innovations do. We are a separate 501c3, wholly owned by the University of New Mexico, formed in 1995, and we do the technology transfer work. We protect the technologies, we market those, we identify partners, we help to form new companies, we manage an incubator, and all of that under our technology transfer umbrella. We also help connect the business community to the university who is looking for access to expertise, facilities, and research, including corporate engagement work. And finally, we facilitate the university's role in economic development, and I would say in particular, working in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Bob mentioned that we use this theme called the Rainforest, and what does that mean? It's based on some work that was done by two, at that time, VCs in Silicon Valley. They have now really gone on to other areas, but they studied entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world in Silicon Valley and Massachusetts, and then really branching out from there, and discovered that there were a number of characteristics that characterize a thriving entrepreneurial system. And it's a biological model. So the rainforest is a biological system that flourishes because all of the species in it are diverse. They work well together, and then the new startup companies in the model are the sprouts, the new sprouts in a rainforest. So one of the key distinctions is that it's a bottom-up model. The entrepreneurs determine the opportunities. It's not a top-down system of, determining particular industry sectors, for example. So we have a staff of 16 people that serve the organization, and they range from overseeing our commercialization and various aspects of that and our economic development efforts. We're governed by a board of directors. One of the unique things I think about UNM Rainforest Innovations, and having worked at several other universities prior to joining UNM-RI in 2003, I really appreciate our model. It is a large board in part because we have representation from university leadership on the board, all the senior administration. We have faculty representation, but that can constitute no more than 40% of the board. So 60% of the board comes from the sectors that we work in: economic development, finance, startups, intellectual property, you name it, and they're represented on our board. So it's a very distinguished board of directors that provides guidance and oversight. So next, let me turn to our commercialization activities. And we use the SOFIA knowledge management system. It's a platform created by Wellspring. It's used by over 500 research institutions worldwide. And so we connect into that system of making sure our new inventions are available for viewing on that larger network. And our faculty and other inventors can disclose right online. They can upload documents. We received 81 disclosures in fiscal year 21. That was down a bit, I will say, because of COVID. We're generally at a run rate 100 to 120, but with labs closing for a year or more, we did see our disclosure rate drop last fiscal year. Once we get a new disclosure, we evaluate those inventions for patentability, and we do this in-house, and kind of initial commercial potential. We hire a number of student interns from UNM who work with us in this capacity. And based on that, we will file provisional applications, patent applications. And generally, we file about 80 to 90% of the disclosures we receive. We will file a provisional, and sometimes multiple provisionals if there's new data that comes out during that 1 year period. During that 1 year, it's very critical for us to do a good job of reaching out, getting feedback about the invention so we can make decisions about what we convert to either PCTs or US utilities. And we convert about half of those provisionals into full patent applications. So at the end of the process, 3 or 4 years later, then we receive the issued patents. We received 54 issued patents in fiscal year 21. Occasionally, we have other IP forms affiliated with research results, including trademarks and copyrights and trade secrets. So UNM may not be as well recognized as other universities, but we have a pretty robust program of patenting our inventions. We have made the list of top 100 worldwide universities with the largest number of issued patents for the 7th year in a row. So once we get that provisional filed and we're kind of on that road, we spend quite a bit of our efforts on the marketing process. And this is germane to semiconductor related inventions as well as anything else. We prepare a non-confidential description of the idea, and then that goes on to our website, onto other websites. And then we purchase commercial databases that help us identify companies that may be good matches for those technologies. We actively reach out. We do a lot of presentations. Typically, several meetings per week are held with investors, entrepreneurs, and companies to really evaluate those technologies. Specifically with respect to startups, we have really quite a few programs for that. We do have a small incubator in our building, which is called the Lobo Rainforest. And there's office space here, student intern support, very low cost for the startup companies. We make lots of connections for our startup companies to investors and others, introductions, trying to network to help build our overall entrepreneurial ecosystem in New Mexico. I will add that we offer these services not just to UNM startups, but others in the region as well. We have an NSF I-Corps site. We're actually finishing up year 5 of our site program. We have a way to invest in our startups through a partnership with the UNM Foundation. The foundation is the university's fundraising and manages the endowment of the university. So we've invested in about 18 companies over the last 5 years. We partner with the local angel investment group and other presentations to investors. The state of New Mexico has a program to invest in venture firms. So that has attracted a number of venture firms to locate here, and then they must invest commensurately with the size of the investment they received from the state. We also have an MOU, like a number of universities do, with Osage University Partners, which invests exclusively in university startups. Some of the programs that help entrepreneurs, and many times our entrepreneurs are quite experienced, and I'll talk about that in a moment. For those who really need more support, especially our student entrepreneurs, we provide regular office hours and mentoring for them. So there have been 151 companies spun out from UNM, and about 47 of them are active here in New Mexico. Here's a listing of them, and a number of these do have semiconductor industry ties or technologies that support them. One of our earlier success stories, a company called Intellisight. It's a high throughput flow cytometry instrument that was developed at the Health Sciences Center. Local investors first, and then out-of-state VCs. The company is still here in Albuquerque. It was sold to a larger firm in 2016. Another one on the life sciences side is a Visa Diagnostics. And the last CEO and this CEO are examples of folks who we can tap into, because there are a number of people who have second homes in Santa Fe, or they have vacationed here and they love the state, they love the outdoors and the climate and everything. It is a great place to live. And so folks like David Joseph, who had a second home in Santa Fe for many years, and then thought he's going to move here and retire. Well, that didn't happen. So we recruited him, and he looked at a number of technologies, and that company now is, pretty far along, ready to introduce their product and raised, substantial amount of money. Another example that is materials related is a Pajarito powder, and they are based on non-platinum fuel cell catalyst materials. They have gotten a fair amount of venture funding and recently closed and are making sales, and they closed on an investment from Hyundai Motor Company. Another flow cytometry example is Venu Bio, which is more recent, and they are based here in Albuquerque, and they've raised about $5 million to date. Something directly related to the semiconductor industry is Anthentica. It's a proprietary security platform using PUFs, physically unclonable functions technology, that creates a digital fingerprint on a chip. Very important for security, as this is getting to be a bigger and bigger issue. So this was funded initially in partnership with our New Mexico Angels, and now has several customers, many of whom who want to remain anonymous. So I can't really mention their names. So one of the things that we do at UNM to encourage our faculty to disclose their inventions is that we have an annual honorary event where we recognize any inventor who has an issued patent in the last year, and also name an innovation fellow. A board committee selects these innovation fellows, and they have substantial bodies of patents, disclosures, commercialization activities. And now we have 9 of those folks who have been inducted into the National Academy of Inventors. And Steve Brewick, I'm going to note him. He's our most prolific inventor, longtime director of our Center for High Technology Materials, and responsible for, a fair number of disclosures and licenses in the semiconductor industry over the years. So how we measure ourselves, these are metrics, invention disclosures, as I mentioned, 100 to 120, although last fiscal year was lower due to pandemic conditions. About 50 or so issued patents in the US and 40 some option and license agreements. So our income, like many universities, does go up and down depending on if you do have the so-called home run. And we're still a younger program compared to some universities who started back in the 80s, right after Bayh-Dole was enacted in 1980. But you can see that our income, started 2-3 million over the years. And then the last 2 years, we had substantial amounts of income, over 50 million. And this was thanks to that Steve Brewick as lead inventor, the technologies that are the basis for FinFETs in the semiconductor industry. One of our very important metrics is how we're doing with startups. And these are metrics that show those in New Mexico versus out of state. Being a public university, this is something, of course, the legislature asks us about. How many jobs are we creating? And so we do studies, periodically to look at that. But we're at a pretty substantial run rate in terms of startups. We have won some awards, one from the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, 2018, and we won the Place Award for our Lobo Rainforest building. We look at ourselves compared to our peers, frequently. And one of the things that Autumn does is look at how universities are doing. This is kind of the most recent data. It's a little bit dated because it's 2018. But we rank 23rd on this list, which is good because we are a mid-sized research university. And then specific to being a mid-sized research university, we ranked 2nd in this report from the Bush Institute and Opus Favio, ranking innovation, impact, productivity. You can look it up if you're interested in the metrics that they use. And we're 2nd on that list. And finally, I will close with just mentioning that we work closely with our partners in the state. We're a small population state, but rich in science and technology. We have Sandia National Labs, Los Alamos National Labs, 2 directorates of the Air Force Research Labs in New Mexico, as well as our partners at New Mexico State, New Mexico Tech, and NASA has a presence in our state as well. So we showcase technologies and startups annually, and the next event is actually coming up on March 1st. So with that, thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Lisa. Let me ask just one quick question. We've heard a lot of talk throughout the rest of the conference earlier today about the need for speed in bringing technologies from the university to the marketplace, and sometimes not worrying so much about who owns what and how we basically can be more creative about managing intellectual property and accelerating innovation development. What would you say would be the most important thing from your point of view in terms of accelerating technology commercialization that universities and organizations like yours can play a role in helping to drive?
It's a really good point, Bob. And I want to mention that a model that isn't really talked about a lot, but I have found over the years being in this field to be quite effective, is if you can get as many early stage startups out there quickly, and you have to have that funding ecosystem to do that, the larger companies often would prefer to work with those startups than to work directly with the university, quite frankly. It's a little easier for them, to do that culturally and IP rules and all of that. So I would say the one thing we could do is to make sure there's a deployment of enough capital so universities can get these baby companies off out of the gate, and then they can choose who to partner with and really and scale up by working with large industry.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Our next panelist is Julie Lenzer. She's the Chief Innovation Officer of Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, ARMI, a relatively new position for her. She's been heavily involved in just about every facet of the entrepreneurial ecosystem development, from being an entrepreneur, policy advisor, funder, builder, investor. She's currently directing this new initiative, but most recently she was the Chief Innovation Officer at the University of Maryland, where she was charged with fostering and deploying innovation to greater economic impact and social impact from the university environment into the business place. She was also the funding director of Quantum Startup Foundry at University of UMD, where she launched global platforms for catalyzing quantum technology-based companies. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who will talk to us about the tech issues that she is helping to innovate in.
Thanks so much, Bob, and good afternoon or good morning to those of you who are perhaps in a different time zone. I'm going to take a little bit different approach. Now that I'm out of academia, I get to speak freely about some of the things that I've seen. And so I'm going to take you through that. Let's see. Get this to change. There we go. I want to give you a little bit more color and background that will tell you a little bit more about my perspective. And I'm going to demystify academia. So those of you who are in academia, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but perhaps sometimes putting a mirror in front of your face to say, yes, this is exactly some of the challenges, because I think it's important to understand all sides of it before you can figure out how to make things better. Talk a little bit about the role in commercialization for universities, and then some ideas for bridging the gaps. So background and perspective, I can't unsee what I've seen. As Bob mentioned, I am actually a recovering entrepreneur who was called into public service a little over 10 years ago with local government as the initial director for the Maryland Center for Entrepreneurship. And it was then that I got into ecosystem building, and I was part of the Startup America Partnership, and in fact, a co-founder of Startup Maryland. And yes, this is a bus that inspired Steve Case to do his Rise of the Rest. We did the Startup Maryland bust across the state of Maryland to connect entrepreneurs with resources. And it was from that position that I got called by the then Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, to come and run the Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And I'm going to guess, and I know UNM, Rainforest, I'm pretty sure we funded them while I was at the EDA. I created the Regional Innovation Strategies Program, which then became the Build to Scale. So I had the unique opportunity to see all over the country the great work that's going on in commercializing deep tech, and also learning kind of a preview, I guess, if you will, to my time at the University of Maryland and where some of the challenges and perhaps opportunities were. But as I mentioned, once you're inside of academia, it's very different than dealing with it. And so hopefully I can help demystify that, or maybe translate some of that for some of you who maybe aren't in academia. So now at Army, and yes, it's a very confusing name because it does sound like the Department of Defense Army, but this is the Advanced Regenerative Manufacturing Institute, still looking at very similar challenges. We're making practical the large-scale manufacturing of engineered tissues and organs, which have, I'm not going to go into that, but it has some really unique challenges and disruptive opportunities. And looking at workforce getting ready to come in and be able to do this type of work. And so the mission of Army, though, is right smack in that investment gap between government, academia, and industry. And so it's an interesting place to find myself in my career and using some of those things that I've learned about academia and working with industry, since I've been on both sides of that. And it is a national footprint organization, but based out of Manchester, New Hampshire. So that's just a little bit of background, so you know where I'm coming from. So let me go into a little bit about understanding academia. And first of all, the challenges in translating deep tech. And I know that the practitioners on here, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but just some of the things that I've seen is the very common characteristics in deep technology. Oftentimes when we come out of the lab or the university, it's very low and oftentimes slow technology readiness level. So it's very early tech. And that presents a very high technical risk. Is this going to work? We don't know yet, but it's going to take most likely a lot of capital to get it there. And when you're creating and disrupting markets, that's a whole nother issue about the technology can be great, but is the market really ready for it? And is somebody willing to pay to have that technology? Is it better enough for somebody to disrupt the way they've been doing things? And I think in the semiconductor industry, that's probably pretty common. Trying to disrupt the manufacturing processes, put in new equipment. It better have a several-fold improvement for you to be able to go back and retrofit. But oftentimes what I find in working with faculty, they've got a hammer and they're looking for a nail. So it's, Lisa talked a little bit about the I-Core program, mentioned that. One of the best tools we used, I think, at the University of Maryland, helping researchers to see that it's not just about the technology, it's about the market opportunity as well. So a typical university, very decentralized and distributed. And again, those of you universities that have your stuff together, I'm not talking about you. But this is what I've seen in working with a lot of my colleagues, some of the challenges that are historical of universities that they have come along. So very decentralized into colleges and different schools. Technology transfer is often under-resourced. And I will say, unless you're getting $52 million suddenly, congratulations on that, Lisa, that's fantastic. Bayh-Dole is an unfunded mandate. And, really hoping that some of these new policies and the National Science Foundation Technology Directorate can change that. But it is by and large left to the university to decide how important it is outside of just the very basic mandate with Bayh-Dole. The universities also tend to compete in many industries, and especially I would say in the computer science, AI, ML, they compete with industry for talent. And it's very hard oftentimes for universities to be able to meet the economic opportunities present within industry. However, there are also those folks who love to do the teaching, are not willing to give it up, and are looking for some way to kind of integrate with industry. Universities don't always have incentives for collaboration. I see a shift in that as we start to look at grand challenges and looking at universities coming together to solve bigger problems. And I'm really excited about that. And, patents are great. Faculty love patents, but entrepreneurial activity, it varies by institution, whether or not that is truly celebrated. And in fact, even though at University of Maryland, we had in our tenure policy, innovation entrepreneurship counted towards tenure, but the tenure policy or the committees that were determining the tenure didn't quite know how to count it. And so it was often discounted in tenure decisions. So that's just something to think about as you're approaching a university and trying to figure out why maybe some of the attitudes or the opportunities just aren't there that you think people should be excited about. So I often like to think about the challenges within academia are like three dogs fighting over one toy. And the three dogs are representing, for us, it was public funding. So as a public university, we have to be good stewards of public funding. We have to be very transparent, and we can't give the appearance that we're putting out something for someone's personal gain. But guess what? We are creating wealth. We are creating wealth for our inventors. We are creating wealth for our industry partners if we're doing it right. So that's a little bit of a conflict I've seen in academia. In addition, then, we have to really uphold research and educational integrity. So from a research perspective, if somebody ever questions your research, but that you were trying to drive a commercial output, you're done. I mean, it's just, you've lost your reputation. You're no longer a trusted partner. Likewise with educational integrity, and this was something I didn't fully appreciate until I was inside, making sure that your students aren't exploited, making sure that your students aren't feeling pressured to drive a commercial output because of the professor's interest perhaps in a technology or a business. And so there is these three forces that are pulling against each other. And I call this, what they're creating is the academic impedance factor of all of these things coming together. So some other common points of stress, if you will. Speed, I think the prior panel, they talked about the speed of academia. That is something that we've tried to work. I say, let's make it easy. I now say, let's make it easier, because I've learned that it's not probably ever going to be easy. There's an aversion to risk in many of these institutions because of the three pressures that I just mentioned before. The time frame, urgency versus academic calendars. I can remember working on a collaborative project before I joined the university. It was a development project, and all of a sudden, come middle of May, I stopped. It took 3 weeks to get an answer. or December. Most people know that it's very hard to get someone in academia in the later month of December and early January. IP ownership tends to be a big stumbling block, especially in dealing with industry, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Universities don't tend to make things. We make maybe prototypes, we make examples, but we don't make things that can go to market. One caveat, I'll say COVID-19 showed us that we could do a lot more than we thought we could for public good. But in general, we're not in the business of producing products for sale. Another thing that's interesting is that tech transfer offices are often asked to choose winners and losers. And I had somebody ask me, actually, as I was interviewing for my job that I'm in today, they said, well, how do you choose winners and losers? And I said, if I knew that, I would be owning an island in the Caribbean, and I would not be sitting here looking for a job, because I would be in venture capital and I would invest in all the winners. And it's just not that simple. Even though the technology might be a winner, doesn't mean that the market is going to be there. Mission alignment, again, students are the reason that higher ed is there, and they're our first priority. So depending on the institution, how important is that translation? I think it varies by the president's vision, but I'm encouraged to see that more and more universities are having a vice president of innovation or chief innovation officer, or vice president in charge of economic development. And I think that's really, really positive sign. And then the cultural mismatch, as I mentioned, faculty oftentimes, depending on where they are and what discipline they're in, they want to do research. They got into it because they want to do research, and translating that or commercialization isn't always something that they really like or think is a positive thing. There's a lot of the integrity that they feel like they want to be pure to their research. And so when you look at the university role in commercialization, I actually had to take the word commercialization out of my comments. When I talk to faculty, I don't use the word commercialization because it just tends to elicit negative emotions. So we talk about taking their great ideas and translating them into to the market, or ideas to impact. That's what really gets them excited. So what is the university role in that? Well, this is one of my favorite slides. I created it when I was part of the U.S. Department of Commerce EDA, and this is the hierarchy of needs in economic development. And it's what you need to create a responsive and resilient ecosystem in general. And you'll notice that engines of innovation, universities, are very much near the top of it. Down the bottom, basic infrastructure, we call that roads and commodes. You got to have all that to have a thriving business class. Technology infrastructure, business support. Universities are starting into that. Universities are doing incubators, accelerators, capital, but the engines of innovation are really what start to drive that resilient and responsive ecosystem. So this stuff is really important, is what this is trying to show. So, what do we do from a development perspective? We help to make our way up the technology readiness level. And I think Lisa may have mentioned that, companies don't like to come in and get technology when it's really low. It's still risky. So they're hoping to find a startup or someone or a university to help de-risk that for them. So most universities live kind of down at the very bottom of that. They don't have the resources, or that's not part of their focus. There are some more universities lately that live, that will maybe start to have some translational funding and commercialization funding, but there's very few that have the resources to get all the way there. And that's why partnerships are really important. So, there's various levels of support, and these are just examples of the types of programs, but I kind of see that our job in helping faculty and startups and students as well come from the expose, where we try to expose as many people as we can, then educate through different training programs and I-Core. And then for those who really want to go the mile with their business, that's when you start getting into support, office space, giving them advisors, mentors, one-on-one counseling, helping them prep for investment, and you hope to get a lot of startups out of that. Now, sorry for the eye chart. You're not expected to read this. This was something that we created at University of Maryland as a flow chart for faculty to see what they needed to do to start a business. And the reason I bring this up is, first of all, they wanted a flow chart. They said, show me how to do it. Well, of course, it's whether it's an academic business or a spin-off, starting a business, there's a pretty common sets of steps to do that. However, when you're in an academic environment, there's a lot of other things that start to get in the way and that you have to worry about, like conflict of interest, which goes back to that academic and research integrity. How to build a team when you're the technical scientist and you need to bring on a business CEO. What about foreign influence? Being close to University of Maryland is about 4 miles from the DC border. I think that made us fair game for let's go in and dig into what their foreign influence, what kinds of folks do we have that are non-US citizens, and where is that in the research and also in the startups? What startups coming into our facilities have foreign investment? Things that you don't have to usually think about if you're not at a university. Private use, conflict of commitment. There are just some things that really make this a little bit harder. And I'm not saying this in a whining type of way. I'm saying this so that those of you who aren't in academia can go and thank those people who are in academia for taking these barriers down and working this stuff for you, because it's not easy. But so how do we bridge the gaps then in driving innovation? So we need to find ways to reduce friction. So one of the things we did at the University of Maryland, we took after the University of Minnesota, is we created a prepaid IP licenses for corporate sponsored research. And what that does is it allows them, industry to come in, and as they're doing a corporate sponsored research, they can pre-negotiate for an extra fee like rights to the IP that comes out of it. So that there's some certainty at the end that they're not going to get, that they have what they need at the end. So this was one thing, and happy to share this again. It came out of the University of Minnesota's, also does this. There's other ways to reduce friction. You know, you talked about a supportive ecosystem, I think earlier today, connecting these technical talent with business, prepping them for investment, startup-friendly progression of space to meet growth needs. I love when we build out these research parks and we have office space for $40 a square foot, but we want startups to locate in that. That's not going to happen. We need
Julie,
to make sure
we're going to need to wrap up.
Yep, I've got
here.
one more slide.
Okay.
Express startup licenses, again, taken from Carolina. Low upfront cash, patent expenses payback over time. There we go. Seek to understand the needs, align objectives, coordinate centrally, and take as many shots on goal as you can. And in fact, I bought my team scratch off lottery tickets because you can't win if you don't play. So how can we get more of this out into the market? There you go. Thank you.
Okay, just one quick question. Do you think that the current evolution of sponsored research from the federal government agencies is making it easier or harder for universities to create startups and launch technology into the commercial space?
I don't think it's making it easier or harder. I think it's a known entity. I mean, we know what government rights are in technology. So I think that that's what the universities know how to deal with. I think, and you look at corporate sponsored research, that's generally research that's going back into the industry. So that's already translated. I think that, again, getting these things funding the bi-dole activities and having some government support for that, rather than trying to drive tech transfer offices to generate their own revenue, I think will go a long way.
Okay, thank you. Our next panelist is Ben Schrag. He's the SBIR STTR Program Director and Policy Liaison at the National Science Foundation. He's been a program director there since 2009. And prior to joining the NSF, he was the Director in Research and Development of Micromagnetics, so really on the high-tech sector of things. He has a PhD in physics from Brown University, and he will speak to the startup role that the NSF is taking actively in helping to move technology out of academia and into the marketplace. Ben.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob, for the invitation. Thanks for my fellow speakers. I think that was great. And thanks everyone for attending. So as Bob mentioned, I'm with the National Science Foundation. And although it's not mentioned explicitly, the startup that Bob mentioned that I came from was actually a semiconductor equipment startup. And so I have scars on my back which show that I've bumped into some of the things that you are probably dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I have a lot of respect for anyone who starts to support them as well. So a few aspects of our small business programs. So these are the Small Business Innovation Research and Small Business Technology Transfer Program. I suspect most of you have heard those terms. I have a screenshot here of the NSF's SBIR homepage, and I will just point that out to show that the term SBIR doesn't appear there. In fact, we're trying to really position our program as seed funding for startups. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the second part of my remarks today will be about some observations that I think may be relevant to this audience, having worked with many hundreds of companies over the last. So the first thing I want to show is data for our current cohort. So NSF funds phases of SBIR awards. The first phase of funding goes to about 400 different companies per year. And the data I show here are data for those companies that we funded at phase 1 in a recent cohort. So this covers a few hundred companies. And the purpose here is obviously to show you that the companies that we are funding really are primarily startup companies. Most of them are quite new, quite small, and for most of them, government funding is a very new thing. Almost none of them have had significant prior SBIR funding, and more than half the companies we fund are getting funded based on the first grant they've ever submitted to NSF, which is, as far as I can tell, agency is the first time you try it, you don't get funded. And so we're very focused on trying to make this program as startup friendly and to make the learning curve relatively gentle to make sure that these new folks can participate. Our program operates at scale. We have a budget of over $200 million per year that goes back out into these awards. And we have between 700 and 900 different small businesses that have active awards in our program at any given time. So it is a significant flow of deals that we see. So the Small Business Innovation Research Program exists across the federal government. It is congressionally mandated, and it's about a $4 billion budget last year. And the 5 agencies dominate the SBIR funding landscape. These 5 agencies listed cover about over 95% of all the funding that goes through the program each year. And this graph shows a chart from a recent publication that shows for the different agencies what percentage of their portfolios is made up by companies with 1 or more awards from the SBIR program. And so again, the idea here is that our focus on startups is pretty unusual in the scope of the federal government. Most of the other federal agencies that fund SBIR are funding most of their awards to companies that have had prior funding from the same program. So this focus on startups at NSF really has evolved organically over the past 15 years. And it evolved based on the idea that we have seen in the past that our biggest commercial outcomes, our biggest wins, were coming disproportionately from the smallest and the newest companies that we were funding. And so by funding startups, we feel like the commercial impacts can be larger. And obviously, we can also move the needle more when we fund a company that's brand new. Our money is more impactful. So we see that as a kind of a double win for our program. This is a screenshot of the different broad topical areas that we offer at NSF. And I just throw this up very quickly to show you that we have a by design, extremely broad range of technology areas and markets verticals that we are open to serving. The idea here is to, again, try to give the startups the freedom and flexibility to pursue their vision, rather than having them try to alter their vision to fit into the NSF's kind of predetermined goals. And one of the things that we think this really helps us to do is to harness the magic of a startup, which is that if they're left to pursue what they're passionate about, they have this combination of agility and grit that can make them just spin up and become very, very successful and special outcomes. And the last slide I have about the program proper here is just to show that even though we are funding very risky technologies, very high risk, difficult, deep technologies with, as everyone has been mentioning, high market risk, high capital requirements, our portfolio has been very successful at creating significant commercial and broader outcomes. So these headlines are from about the last 12 months in our portfolio, just a fairly recent news. And among the recent success stories that we've had were the mid 9-figure exits of both Inpri and Lion Semiconductor, both semiconductor success stories that were both funded very, very early on by the NSF when they were just getting started. What we've seen in recent news from our portfolio makes us convinced, or at least makes me convinced, that even though it's very difficult, there's never been a better time or a better place to launch a deep technology startup than here and now. So I'm going to shift now. I have a few more slides that really focus on just basically the insights that the team here at NSF has gained by working with hundreds and hundreds of companies per year. And we do try to work with them pretty closely to understand them better and to support them better. So hopefully these observations will be relevant for those folks who either touch on the process of technology transfer in some way, or who work with startups really at the very formative stages of the process. The first thing I want to just point out is that this idea that value of these new technologies is very fluid. You know, my recommendation is to not overestimate the intrinsic value of a new invention. It's tempting to assume that each new technology, once the relevant R&D has been done to determine the kind of scientific contours, can be valued or estimated based on some sort of traditional market analysis. And this is very true for folks grounded in the research enterprise, where they assume that the technology itself or the idea itself, that's where most of the value lies in these technologies. But in my experience, watching these teams go from really just a team and a technology to the eventual outcome of an actual startup, the obscure equation that determines the actual value and the broader impact of any given technology is much less about the scientific details of the innovation. It's actually dominated by the outcomes of the continual interactions between the founders of the startup, or those who are developing the innovation, and the market stakeholders that they hope to impact. And the frequency of these interactions and success of these interactions is completely dominated by the founders themselves, by the people who are leading this thing. And in my experience, the practices vary vastly based on the founders. And so the team is the most important factor in determining the value, monetary or otherwise, of any new innovation. And so for most of our successful companies, really, we can only attribute a fairly small portion of any kind of exit value to the intrinsics of the science. Most of it is added by the founders along the way. And so my sense is that the early on in the companies, the best team is the one that can accumulate the most information about the customer and the market the most rapidly. And the rate of learning is the metric that's the most crucial for these kinds of companies. And so the takeaway here for those who are involved in this is that placing too high an assumed value on the formal IP, on the invention disclosure or the provisional patents, creates a risk that you might make it too difficult or too expensive for one or more founders to be able to take that and run with it, which is really what you want to have happen. I swear I didn't coordinate with Julie, but I've got a hammer nail analogy as well. And this is probably the I-core influence. I suspect that's maybe where it comes from. But I just wanted to make a point here that the most natural way to do a startup, to be an entrepreneur, is to see a problem in the world or an opportunity, and then based on that to kind of figure out a solution to that problem. This is called a market in search of technology venture, so MIST, a MIST venture. Unfortunately, many deep technology-based translation efforts, they really start out the opposite. What happens is that some new discovery or new insight falls out from some research or R&D effort, and the parameters of that insight or innovation and the limitations of its technology, they're determined by nature. Nature tells you what you get. And so that's a hammer that just falls out of the sky, and there's no nail in are technology in search of market, TISM ventures. And when you have a venture where the hammer comes first and the nail is not in sight, this is about as unpredictable as it gets, because you have both technical risk and you have market risk around financing. You want to know, is there a nail? Are there multiple nails? Can you build the hammer? There's just a lot of things that have to come together. And so in these cases, it's my opinion that attempting to directly license these kind of technologies to an established player is really likely to undervalue the innovation. because most established licensees are not going to bother to evaluate all the nails that are out there. They're going to pick one or two that are most familiar with and that align with their business strategy. And so statistically, it's likely that licensing in these cases may leave value on the table. So my opinion, which is biased, the best thing to do in such cases is to really place a new innovation in the hands of a startup team. The startup team should have the technical chops to further develop the technology, and also the interest and the ability to rapidly look for and evaluate new nails. The best teams to do this, in our experience, are hardworking, professionally hungry, intellectually curious, and mentally flexible. And by far, as far as we can tell, the most common way that you can find these team members, these founders, is to look for the members of the research group that discovered the technology, or adjacent groups, and people who have an eye for creating real-world impact, and most importantly, who have no other long-term ongoing professional commitments. You need to find people to found the company with a clear calendar. It's very important. This structure, where you have a company that's founded and led primarily by technical people, scientists and engineers, turned first-time entrepreneurs who have recently stepped out of a research institution, this structure is by far the most common success mode that we have seen among the portfolio companies that have been big successes in recent years. It's not even close. This is by far the most common way it happens. I think this is my last second to last slide. Technology translation is, of course, about taking technology from the lab to the market. But almost all universities, as was just mentioned, are not designed or interested in being at the center of a new commercial effort. And most full-time faculty members are not interested as well. And so in order to really translate technology, you need to have another translation that happens. And that's the translation where the technology gets handed off from the research institution that generated the technology and from the full-time researchers that usually hold sway over the technology to the dedicated and focused entrepreneurs who can commit themselves to the multi-year efforts needed to take this to a commercial outcome. And so the best things, or one of the best things that can be done by those who hope to kind of have success here, is to encourage a structure and a culture where the technology is centered with the people and the entity that represent the future, rather than those who had built and shepherded it to that point. And as we mentioned, a lot of times,
Ben, we're gonna have to wrap it up because we're running a little bit behind.
Okay, sounds good. I got one more minute. So again, I can skip my last slide, but my last point here is to basically note that a lot of times the best people to lead these ventures were very recently the subordinates of those who invented the technology, and trying to figure out a way to reverse those roles so that these founders are now able to take the reins of the technology is difficult and can create a lot of tension. But it's really important, and it does lead to the best outcomes. And by the way, if you're able to do that, it will also lead to much more happy alumni for your university. And so this photo on my slide here is a company called Via Separations, spun out of MIT, where they were able to very well make that transition, where Schrag Dave, who is the CEO of the company, was the graduate advisee of Professor Jeffrey Grossman, who was the inventor of the technology. And I will skip my last slide and throw up my contact information. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. And that's going to wrap this panel. At this point, we're going to go on to our next session, session 3, taking a look at preparation and assistance of proto companies and early startups with incubators and accelerators. And at this point, I'm going to turn the program over to Rick Gardner from the University of Buffalo.